We have at least 3 forms of microphones and recording up here. Might have been simpler just to have the NSA broadcast the entire proceeding, since I'm sure they're listening in as they do to everything else. We turn our attention this morning from the Genesis narrative to the gospel narrative on human government and what Jesus says about it. And so I will do that, prefacing it with a few comments from 1 Samuel 8. And so the 2 handouts you might want to have before you are one on 1 Samuel 8 and another notes on Jesus' thoughts about human government in the Gospels. And you'll note, by the way, also by way of introduction, how rarely Jesus speaks about human government in the Gospels. He touches upon it on 3 occasions, and barely so. And that itself, I think, is not inconsequential, because, as we might have put it at one point, he had bigger fish to fry. That he seems to have regarded the whole thing with a sort of benign contempt or indifference. And so when we look to develop a distinctly Christian understanding of government, our natural inclination would be to open our concordance or Gospels and to read them and see what Christ said about them. And we're somewhat disappointed by the dearth of instruction. There's very little there, which I take to be consequential in and of itself. But I'd like to say a few words about 1 Samuel 8, which I regard as the most consequential unknown passage in Holy Scripture. There are many more consequential passages in Holy Scripture, and possibly a few that are more unknown. But there is not another passage in Holy Scripture, in my judgment, that is both as consequential and as rarely discussed as 1 Samuel 8. So we have many other Old Testament passages that we are familiar with that are much less consequential, it seems to me, than 1 Samuel 8. And so you'll note that the text, the narrative of it, falls into these several parts. When the elders of Israel gathered and came to Samuel, you recall, by the way, the relation of prophet and monarchy in the Old Covenant, that while the monarch rules, he only does so when the prophet appoints or removes him from office. So the prophet is the connection between Yahweh as the governor of all things to the king as the governor of Israel or Judah. And so the prophets determine, Samuel and later Nathan and so forth, who will be monarch and who will not. They're involved in the whole process. So they come to Samuel knowing that if you want to get to Yahweh, you have to go through the prophet. You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. And even before verse 6, you and I should be a little staggered by that. Remember the Israelites, after they got right on the cusp of the promised land, not in Moses' generation, but then in Joshua's, then in the period of the judges, they actually begin to disinherit the Canaanites from the land of Canaan. And they do so the entire time without a standing monarch or a standing army. Instead, it would say, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Gideon, and he went out and slew 300 Amalekites. Right? That's, by the way, a very funny kind of recurring expression at one level, isn't it, when we're reading through the conquest of the land narrative, that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon someone and he went out and slew. Right? It kind of makes you hesitant to pray for Holy Ghost revival, doesn't it, that this is the case. And so the Spirit is associated with military victory in the entire period of the Judges. And so when it says, now appoint for us a king to judge us, and of course judge means to rule, because the judges that we think of, Deborah and Gideon and Barak and Othniel and Ehud and so forth, these are all people who led military incursions against the Canaanites. So they were not judges in our trifold branch of government as executive, judicial, and legislative. They were much more like the executive branch, the people with military and police power. And so what they were really looking for is someone to go out there and win military victories for them. But it says, like the nations. You mean the nations that Yahweh just dispossessed when you didn't have a king? Right? That's the way that verse 5, should sound to us. That having removed the peoples of the land militarily and defeated them without a king and without any military. Remember, Gideon had to reduce his group from, 20,000? Down to 300 who lapped the water like dogs? What a curious thing. Lest they say, our hand and arm have gotten us the victory. He deliberately diminishes the size of his military in order so that it can be clear that it was Yahweh and not their own hand that got them the victory. So they fought, you might say, with one hand tied behind their back quite deliberately, because all they needed was the Spirit of Yahweh. They didn't need anything else. And so after all this period of coming into the land of Canaan, as a group of people who've been enslaved for 500 years with no capacity to organize government or military, they've been slaves. And they now come in and disinvest these very highly refined civilizations in the ancient Near East, the Canaanites. These were high-tech, highly organized, bureaucratized cultures, very, very refined. And the Israelites, with the power of the Holy Spirit, were able to remove them from the land. And now that Yahweh has done this for them, they say, no, we want to be like the other nations. Give us a king like they have. The kings who failed to protect them. The kings who could not resist the powers of our army influenced by the Spirit of Yahweh. So in one of the most understated statements in the Holy Scripture, verse 6 says, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. You bet it displeased him. And so then Nathan goes Samuel goes to take the matter before Yahweh, and we're looking for Yahweh to comfort Samuel and say, don't worry, it's not as bad as you think. And instead he says, actually it's worse than you think. It's a classic misery loves company, is the response. And so when Samuel prayed to the Lord, Yahweh said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all that they have done. From the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. Talk about misery loves company, right? And this is like all the rebellion that they've ever done to now. This is exactly what we should have expected. Domino after domino after domino after domino after domino. It eventually will come to the fact that they will reject me as their king and choose someone else to be their king. They love to see the visible accoutrement of a standing military and a king. Hitler marching his thousands down the streets of Berlin and so forth. The big display with tanks and materiel and so forth. Wow, does that make us feel secure, right? That's what we want. We don't want the Spirit of Yahweh to fall upon Gideon out of the blue when who knows when, right? Give us all of this stuff that we can trust in. And so later you recall their psalm. Some trust in horses and some trust in chariots. But we will trust in the name of the Lord our God. By that point they realized it was a mistake. That they had trusted in horses. They had trusted in chariots. And they should have trusted in the name of the Lord their God. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. And he said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to be his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. By the way, that's not so much a position of honor. Remember that the horse is a very powerful military tool in the ancient world, very significant tool. And what you want to do is, if you're the defender, you want to stop the horses. And so your spear people come out front and they try to get the horses. And so lest the horses absorb spears, you send some people to run before the chariots to absorb the spears because they are less important to you than a horse. So to run before the chariots means you get to be spear fodder. You get to go out there and prevent the horses from being stabbed with spears. And so that's what the king will do. He'll send your sons out there in front, regard them as less than a horse, and let them take the brunt of the first row of spears. And so they put them out there to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, 50s, some to plow his ground, some to reap his harvest, make implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. Take the best of your fields and vineyards. Take the tenth of your grain of your vineyards. Take your male servants, female servants, best of your young and your donkeys. Put them to his work. take a tenth of your flocks, you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you've chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. Now you'll note that in italics I mentioned the Hebrew verb lakach appears 8 times. Take. Right? It's the repeated verb. He will take, he will take, he will take, he will take, he will take. And note Uriah and Bathsheba. He will take your sons and make them run before the chariots. He put Uriah on the front line to be the first killed. Uriah, who refused to take the vacation because he stayed to guard the king. How can I go home and have a vacation? I'm going to stay here and guard my prince, right? This loyal servant. He sends him out on the front lines deliberately to be killed, right? And then if you think of Bathsheba, he will take your daughters, right? And so that's why I suggest that Psalm 51 is David's lament over having done unwittingly all the things that 1 Samuel 8 said a rotten king would do. And it was Israel's way of lamenting that their forefathers had ever asked for a king. And so Psalm 51 did not function in the tabernacle ever the way it functions among the Christian churches as just an example of a typical pious person confessing his sin. Blood guiltiness meant blood guiltiness. Uriah was murdered. And when he says, and take not your Holy Spirit from me, he remembered his own installation when it says, and the Spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul, David's predecessor, and fell upon David to this day. And so since the prophet had taken the Spirit away from Saul and put it upon David to be king, now he's saying, don't do the same thing to me you did to Saul and take the Spirit away. So David's lamenting his failure as monarch, and Israel's lamenting that they ever asked for one. And we just cannot, as Christians, it seems to me, hear the thing easily the way they heard it as the virtual fulfillment of everything pledged in 1 Samuel 8. That's why it's there. It is a lament of royal failure. It is not merely or primarily a lament of personal or moral failure. It is royal failure, the failure of them to ask for a king, and the failure he was there. So this is what Yahweh says for Samuel to tell the Israelites. This is what's going to happen. And there are 2 approaches to interpreting the text, and I think in this case there only can be 2 approaches to the text. And I think that they're both plausible, by the way. One approach is that Yahweh is promising that their king, unlike all the other kings of the earth, will be miraculously bad in some ways. That as an act of divine judgment on Israel for their insistence of this, that he will raise up conspicuously evil rulers, distinguishing themselves by their difference from most rulers by being so self-aggrandizing. That's one interpretation. The other interpretation that I embrace for 2 contextual reasons is that he'll say, no, he'll be just like every other ruler. This is just the way rulers are. They all are self-aggrandizing. They all abuse their privilege. They all take their position of service and make it as an opportunity for them to be served. And so they do not serve and defend others. They serve and defend themselves. And they self-aggrandize because that's human nature. And I do so for the twofold reason that Genesis 9 says that the human in his governing role and ruling over the earth would be a fearsome and dreadful thing, even to the animate forms of life, right? And then later, because the broader context in the canon, as we will see, the teaching of Jesus. Because I think when we turn to the next handout to the teaching of Jesus, Jesus does not see it as exceptional or unusual for governors and rulers to be wicked and self-aggrandizing. He sees it as being par for the course. It's perfectly ordinary. He says, what did you expect a ruler to do? After all, he's a ruler, right? And so if we turn to that then, and I leave both those interpretations otherwise open, either Israel will be the only people on the planet to have a king who's wicked, miraculously so as an act of judgment, or she will have a king who's just like all other kings, horribly wicked and self-aggrandizing, and this will be God's ironic act of judgment. You want this? You want this bed? Well, then lie in it, right? So I take it that way because Greg Beale persuaded me years ago that most biblical judgment is ironic, and I think this one is also. But if we turn to the 3 passages in which Jesus addresses government, twice civil government and once the government of those who were running the temple or misrunning the temple, we see the fairly well-known passage of Jesus talking about rendering to Caesar. And let me just mention two brief things about the geopolitical and rhetorical context of this passage. Geopolitically, remember that the Greeks and later the Romans were not real happy with the Jews in Palestine. When the Greeks had their geographically large empire, and later the Romans after them, this very, very large empire that covered a lot of ground, to unify the empire, they realized that laws alone wouldn't do it. What you wanted to do is create an ethos in which your people shared together some sense of loyalty, patriotism, and common life together. And so they frowned upon religions that were distinctive or that separated one part of your empire from the other parts. And so the Jews were a special problem. Any form of polytheism will work because, Jeff, if you have 20 deities and Marcia, you have 18, still, none of your 18 will be too jealous of his 20 because they're all getting some affection and tender loving care. And so all forms of polytheism can tolerate other forms of polytheism. Oh, you've got a god for being down 2 runs in the 9th inning. Fine, no problem, right? We've got one who helps the pitcher in the 3rd. Everybody's got a deity, right? And so, but the problem was Israel's covenant required her to segregate herself from the nations around her. It required her to be different. God called her a peculiar nation, God's own people. And when they returned from Babylonian captivity to their land and intermarried with the women of the land, Ezra says, you have broken the covenant. All right? Now, they hadn't broken the Sabbath. They hadn't committed murder. They hadn't reset up the Baals or the Ashtaroth poles and so forth. All they had done was marry the women of the land. He says, you've broken the covenant. So Israel had learned not to assimilate because the Mosaic law said, do not assimilate. And then the Greeks and the Romans said, assimilate, assimilate. And they had no problems assimilating this group, that group, this group, that group. They couldn't assimilate the Jews. These stupid Jews still want to sacrifice goats in their temple, right? How do we get them to stop that nonsense, right? And so there was this very, very tenuous relationship by the time of Jesus between the Roman authorities and the Jews, because it had been that way for several centuries, that it was hard to assimilate the Jews with all of their distinctiveness into the polytheistic world of the pagan cultures that had embraced them and conquered them militarily. So that's the geopolitical context. And then I just remind you of the rhetorical context here in Luke 20, sort of to offset what I commonly hear. Often in conversations about Jesus and civil government, people say, well, you do recall Jesus' teaching about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And I say, well, now, this isn't a doctrinal context. This isn't the Sermon on the Mount, right? And great crowds were gathered together, and he went up on the mount and spoke to them, saying, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. The context is they're obviously trying to arrest him, seize him, and probably have the authorities kill him. Right? You might as ask, what was O.J. Simpson's doctrine when he was on trial and answered the questions by the prosecuting attorney? Right? Well, people in those situations are sometimes evasive or coy, possibly even dismissive or sarcastic. Right? He's on trial effectively. And so this is not Jesus sitting down in a classroom saying, let me give 3 lectures on geopolitical theory, starting with an historical survey of them from the beginning of the world until the present, and then giving you 4 or 5 principles about it. This is Jesus cannily and cunningly responding to an attempt to trap him. And the text tells him so. So it's very important to recognize that's the context in which he says, render to Caesar, as it were. So the scribes and chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour. I don't think this was a Pentecostal laying on of hands, right? Right? They wanted to lengthen one of his legs. I used to try to go to those hoping they'd lengthen both. It didn't work. And so this laying on of hands was not for the purpose of healing or imparting some spiritual gift and so forth. They wanted to grasp him, right, to take him away at that very hour. For they perceived that he had told this parable, the one about the wicked tenants, the previous parable. They perceived that he told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they realized that Jesus has regarded the Israelites as having poorly tended God's garden for years and are worthy of judgment. They're the kind of people who've killed the people he sent, treated rudely those they sent, the prophets and so forth, and then he sends a son and they kill him. They perceived that he was talking about that. This is not a friendly doctrinal thing. You may like or dislike what I'm saying today, but you're not trying to kill me, right? And I'm not accusing you of trying to have killed somebody, right? It's a much friendlier atmosphere than this atmosphere. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere. The verb there is who acted hypocritically to be sincere, that they might catch him in something that he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the government. All of this indicates that they were looking for an excuse physically to seize him and to take him against his will before the political authorities to have him either imprisoned or put to death. And so that's the context. They're not saying, gentle master, we perceive that you are a rabbi sent from God. What are your thoughts about civil government? And how should we relate to it? They're trying to kill him. So they ask him, teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? Now, here today in a church and so forth, a building devoted to the worship of God, we will not describe verse 21 as we would in other circumstances. Instead, I'll say it's baloney. But there's another expression, a little more bovine, having to do with the backside of the bovine creature, that is what we would have said under other circumstances, right? What baloney this is, right? For them to come up and this, here the text has said they're spies, they're sending spies, they're pretending, they're trying to grab him, they want to do this, that, and the other. Oh, we see that you're a teacher, right? You show no partiality, but teach the truths of God, right? They're trying to get him to drop his defenses. Oh, I'm among friends here, right? That's what they're hoping. They will butter him up, and he, right, if he's unclever, will think, oh, they love me here, right? This is great. This is like a room without a mother-in-law present. This is wonderful. And so truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? Now notice the question is a Jewish question, not a Roman question. Every Roman knows it's lawful to pay tribute to Caesar. It's the Jews, right, who in their accommodation with the Greeks and then the Romans later, who didn't know whether it was lawful to support this oppressive regime or not. And so there was a difference of opinion among the Jews, probably from the 3rd century BC until the present when Jesus was teaching. There was this difference of opinion. Is it even lawful for the followers of Yahweh to aid and abet their political oppressors? And of course the Maccabees said absolutely not. We should raise up arms against them. If you're going to give money, give it to the Maccabean revolt. Give it to the sons of Mattathias. And let's go after them, right? The last thing you want to do is pray for the peace of the city, as it were, to use Babylonian captivity language. This is time to rise up in rebellion. And so it was a legitimate Jewish question in the day. But they raise it because it's one of those questions where you are darned if you do and darned if you don't. See, I dodged it twice in one day. I dodged saying something I shouldn't say. It's a twofer. So here's a situation where if on the one hand they say, yes, it's lawful to support these oppressive Romans, then the zealots among the Jews will come after him for his complicity with their oppressive Roman rulers. But if they say it's not lawful, then it will be a no-brainer to have him arrested by the Romans. And recall later, just before his official trial, they accuse him of teaching people not to pay taxes to Caesar. Now, I'm not saying they were telling the truth, but there's enough of what he said in this passage that they could plausibly argue that that's what he was saying. They could plausibly argue that he told people not to do so. So you can see that that's what they were trying to achieve, because it later happened that they alleged that he was being uncompliant with the Roman authorities. And so they baloney their way up, and in the text, of course, says he perceived their craftiness, right? That they were trying to trap him. He didn't perceive that these are students in semester 1 on the fundamental theorem of the calculus, and they're saying, well, could you explain to us derivatives And could you explain to us limits in these kinds of things? By the way, I don't understand either of them. Right? I can't talk about limits, right? As x approaches 0, my understanding of the matter approaches 0. So I can't lecture you on as x approaches 0. I'm not capable of doing it. But in that case, you would have a genuine academic setting where someone's just calmly there trying to receive instruction. But he perceived their craftiness and says to them, "Show me a denarius." All right. And so, and whose likeness and inscription does it have? And they said, "Caesar's." So he said, "Okay, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." So what he's saying is if someone's gone to all the trouble of minting coins, and it's got his likeness on it, Tiberius probably at this point, possibly an earlier one, if it's got his image on it, and he's made it, well, I suppose it's his. And like any craftsman or maker, he's fashioned a thing or had it fashioned, and it's his. And then give to God the things that are God's. Which, of course, implicitly means the only thing on this planet that belongs to Caesar is this thing that he's minted. Everything else has the stamp of God, the creator of all things, on it, and everything else belongs to God, and Caesar can't touch it. Well, now that's a different spin on the whole thing, isn't it? Right? A very different spin. But that was his point, was to make such a thing. This is his because he had it minted with his image on it. You see anything else? Does the tree have Tiberius's image on it? Right? Does the grass? Does the sparrow? Do any of these things have his image? Who made them? Who minted them? Whose are they? He says. So he does not quite wave at Caesar, what I call an economical wave. Why use 5 fingers when you can use 1? He says, right? But rhetorically and verbally, he effectively gives Caesar an economical wave, right? That's effectively what he does. I'll get him off my back. I'll get these crazy, crafty accusers off my back. But I don't care about this person at all. Give him what's his. Let's go on with something more important. Let me dodge this silly effort to trap me. Let's move on to something else more equivalent. So Jacques Ellul rightly says, I think, about this, whatever does not bear Caesar's mark does not belong to him. It all belongs to God. This is where the real conscientious objection arises. Caesar has no right whatever to the rest. I think that is the logical conclusion we would arrive from at this. He does not say, render to Caesar whatever Caesar asks for. He asks whose inscription is on this, right? So I guess our dollar bills belong to Washington, and our $10 bills to Jefferson or Hamilton or something like that. We go down the line sort of a thing is what he's saying. But if it doesn't have his name and likeness on it, it belongs to whosever name and likeness it does have on it, and the whole world is stamped with God's authority because he's the maker of the whole thing. So this stupid coinage that he had minted, he can have. But he doesn't. We do not owe him anything else, Ellul says. I think that that is the right way to take it. In which case, then, the passage means nearly the opposite of what we have normally thought it meant, right? That we should compliantly and respectfully demur to anything which our usurious taxers asked us to do, right? That's, I think, how the Christian church has quite frequently dealt with it. And Ellul says, you don't understand that he's doing the old Jewish trick where they're trying to catch him verbally and he's fighting back verbally. It's a sword drill kind of a thing, and they're fighting back. They're sparring with one another. They're trying to kill him. And he's trying to find a way of avoiding being killed because his ministry's not over yet. And he understands that my hour is not yet come. And so during the earlier parts of his ministry, he slips away. He avoids arrest. He avoids betrayal and so forth. They told him not to go up to one of the feasts, in John's gospel, because they said they'll arrest you and kill you. And so he decides not to go up. But later he does go up in secret, the text says. He goes up quietly and secretly and slides in and out and so forth so they can't get him. So all of this is deliberate. He's delaying the arrest and betrayal and crucifixion until the right moment. And they're trying to catch him early, as it were. And they're trying to put him to death. So he finds this clever way, right? this clever way of finding, as it were, he was his own Clarence Darrow, as it were. He was his own canny lawyer that gets himself in a situation where they're so puzzled they don't really know what to do. And they were not able, in the presence of the people, to catch him in what he said. But marveling at his answer, they became silent. He had answered them in a way that they couldn't quite catch him. Could you fault him if you were Jewish for merely letting the emperor have what was the emperor's? If you're Roman, could you fault him for letting Caesar have what was Caesar's? Nobody could fault him. So they're shocked, right? They were not able to catch him, and marveling at his answer, they remained silent. Almost the kind of begrudging respect you have for an opponent who defeats you by an unusual measure of ability. Marveling. They couldn't believe he got himself off of this. They had cooked up a scheme where he was either going to create an enmity with the Jews on the one hand or the Romans on the other. We got him, right? We have painted him into a corner. He's coming out with something on the bottom of his shoes. And he comes out of the corner with nothing on the bottom of his shoes. And they go, how did he do that? Right? This guy's a miracle worker virtually, right? What a magic he's doing here. How did he do this, right? So it says they marveled at him. That's the normal verb used in the Gospels for when he does a miracle. He walks on water and they marvel at him, right? He takes a person who's been ill most of his life and heals him, and they marvel at him. He calms the storm, and they marvel at him. And so his very accusers who tried to trap him here marveled at his ability to dodge this. He was the artful dodger at this occasion, and they just had to become silent. He had defeated them at their own verbal game. There was nothing else they could say. And so they just threw up their hands and said, well, we'll try again some other time, I suppose. But he had them. So I want to peek at a couple other places where he also does this. But this is the passage that you find that we converse about so frequently when you and I talk about Jesus' attitude towards government. At some point you have to deal with the render unto Caesar passage. And I take essentially Jacques Ellul's understanding of the passage as the most likely interpretation of it. And so if you've got a question or two, pen those in the margin, because I'd like to say a word or two about these others and then give you a chance to ask questions about any of the three, because there are these two other reasonably well-known passages as well. The second one deals with the temple tax. So the temple tax was, of course, not a tax that the Romans imposed upon the Jews. It was a tax which Jews imposed upon the Jews. And recall that the law of Moses does not require this. Now, the law of Moses requires a lot of things, right? If you don't believe it, read Numbers and Leviticus aloud to your children sometime, and you'll see it requires a lot of things, because the children pass out like this. And you take them to the emergency room because they're comatose, because you've been reading Numbers and Leviticus to them, and so forth. So many things are required in such detail that the poor children just flop over like this at some point. Fatigue. Please, Mom, I'll make my bed for a week. Don't read any more Leviticus. So there's plenty of stuff that is required, but there is no provision in the law of Moses to require a financial tax from our fellow Israelites who come to bring the sacrifices required by the law of Moses. It's enough that we have to bring this animal for this sin, this animal for that sin, this grain offering for this cereal offering for that. We don't add to that burdensome reality a tax. But some of the Jews had done so. Some of the priests who ran the temple had started taxing people with this tax. And so this group is even craftier at some level than the previous group, because they try to trap Jesus indirectly by going to Peter, right? Does not your teacher pay the tax? Right? Putting old Peter on the spot. Rocky, as we call him in Greek. Does your teacher not pay the tax? He said yes. He probably had no idea. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? Now, when you raise a rhetorical question, and if you have reasonable competence, you know the answer. You frame the question merely rhetorically, not because you're puzzled. So if Jesus raises this question intelligently, and I judge that he did, he knows what kind of answer he's likely to get, because that's the whole power of such rhetorical reasoning is that the person with his own mouth acknowledges what you want him to acknowledge. It's like Nathan the prophet before David. And he tells him about the sheep and the man with one and the one with 100 and so forth and that kind of a thing. And David says a man who does such a thing deserves to die. Condemns himself out of his own mouth. So the question is raised because Jesus knows perfectly well what Simon's going to say. And when he said, from others, right, from whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? And when he said, from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. Now notice, Jesus knew perfectly well what the answer was going to be. When people get in power, do they tax their own or do they tax everybody else? They tax everybody else, right? This is just obvious. We know this. And so, however, not to give offense, go to the sea and cast a hook. And take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. So it was a half shekel tax. And so he says, now, if you and I permitted ourselves to laugh at things that happen in the gospel, we would laugh here. The problem is, out of our respect for Holy Scripture as inspired, we think certainly no one who's inspired would say something funny. But sometimes inspired people say very funny things, right? And this one is a knee slapper, right? It's the only wasted miracle in the Gospels. Every other miracle actually heals a person, raises someone from the dead, drives demons out of people, feeds 5,000 people. Every other miracle is in some sense a sign of the Messianic era, the world to come, full of rich eschatological fruit and health and life and so forth. This is the only one that's the one-handed salute or the one-fingered salute. It's the only one. You mean a fish is going to have a coin? And it's going to happen to be exactly the right amount for Peter and Jesus? A half for Peter and a half for Jesus? What magician could do this? Pull a coin out of a fish that happens to be exactly the amount required. Fish were regarded as a little bit on the downside of things. The Mosaic law doesn't say you have to bring them. You couldn't bring them for sacrifice. It doesn't prohibit them like ham, but it doesn't speak particularly well, so the fish was not necessarily highly regarded in Jewish culture. But the digestive tract was thought of pretty reasonably well in Jewish culture, and they reasoned that it worked pretty much like you and I think. And that is that what goes in the mouth eventually comes up the other side of the fish, comes right out the other end. And so the coin that's in the fish at this point is incipient fish poop, right? It's about to be fish poop. And he says, take that incipient fish poop and give it to them, all right? And lo and behold, it will happen to be the right amount. And so I think it's got to be the only funny miracle in the whole Bible. That they go to, why doesn't Jesus just say, hey, does somebody have a shekel here to get this problem solved with? Instead, he sends Peter to the boat. Peter fishes for a while. A fish comes up with a coin in its mouth. And it just happens to be exactly the right amount for Peter and for Jesus. And now the problem is solved, right? Such a contemptuous use of a miracle seems to me quite clever that he would do this. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. And it says not to give offense to them. So he's aware that now he's got to get them off his back. And so just to get rid of them, right? It's almost like a nagging child while mom's trying to get something done in the kitchen. And so she gives the child a little thing of Cheerios or a piece of fruit, right? Here, just leave me alone and let me finish doing what I'm doing here, kind of a thing. And so it's just sort of get rid of these nuisances here, right? Go see if you can't find a fish with a coin in its mouth, right? And then give them that nasty old about to be fish poop coin, and see if that won't solve the problem, right? And so you can almost imagine Peter holding the thing like this as he takes it out of a fish mouth, right? Who in the world wants anything out of a fish's mouth? I think I did it once in my life on the Chesapeake Bay when we caught a fish. My nephew was about 15, brought a fish up into the boat. I was smoking a Honduran cigar at the time. And I said, look, Robbie, it's a garfish. Gar, get it? So I put it there, and sure enough, the thing fastened on it, and smoke came out of his gills. Right? kind of a neat thing to watch. And so I took it back because he was enjoying it too much. We threw him back in the bay, and I finished the cigar. But most people don't want something that comes out of a fish's mouth. I think I'm the only one I know who's ever done it. Normal people don't do that kind of a thing. But I sort of did. And actually, the cigar was a little bit better before the fish had imbibed than it was after. By the way, I really made points with my nephew. He's still to this day, he's pushing 40 and still thinks Uncle Dave's neat because Uncle Dave's demented. So that's what happens with that one. And it really is a funny passage, I think, that Eliul also thinks is really quite a funny passage, an expression of contempt for those who are in authority, because people who are in authority ordinarily are contemptible, and so Jesus treats them with contempt. And then the other one, is when the disciples are arguing over who's going to be at the right and the left when Jesus comes and so forth, knuckleheads. Here he is towards the end of his ministry. He's about to be handed over to the chief priests and scribes and so forth. And ever since 16:21 of Matthew, that's what he's been saying. From this time on, he explained to them that it was necessary for the Son of Man to go away and suffer many things at the hands of the chief priests, scribes, and elders, and to be crucified. And so having taught them all this, instead of them saying, this has got to be the toughest thing you've done yet, they're debating over who will get a more honored position when he returns. And so he called and says, he basically said, you're doing the same thing that the crazy knucklehead Gentiles do. Who's going to have the positions of prominence? You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to serve, but to be served and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so note this remarkable passage in which he says this. Now note the rhetoric of this. You know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them. Once again, if you say you know or we know rhetorically, and there's any chance that it wouldn't be generally concurred in, you've lost all the power of what you said. The purpose of our using that language in argumentation is to say, look, we all agree on this. Right? Now, if what we say, what follows that? One of my colleagues who taught history at Grove City used just to test to see if the students were listening, right? Not the Morrises, who are always good listeners, but the other students. Butch would sometimes just throw out an outrageous thing. Now, as you know, Lincoln was a flaming homosexual, he said one day in his class. And some of the students are writing it all down. Lincoln flaming. Right. But one or two kind of going like this. So the power of the rhetoric is gone if you say something that's going to be disputed. And so when Jesus says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, if they could have easily refuted that, said, well, no, wait a minute, there was Emperor so-and-so, terrific guy, right? But they couldn't think of Emperor so-and-so, could they? And says, you know this, right? That the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones exercise authority over them. And the verb translated lord it over them is very rare in the New Testament. But it is used of the demoniac in the Acts of the Apostles, who mastered them and overpowered them. The verb translated mastered them is the verb translated lorded over them here. A violent act, even in fact, that is done here. And so he says, this is the way the world functions. Everyone wants to be in authority over others and to rule over them. It's not that way with the Son of Man, though, is it? He says. Is that what I taught you? Did I not teach you that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many? If you'd be great among you, be a servant of all. Don't be like these rulers, because rulers do the kind of thing 1 Samuel 8 said. Don't be like those people. Don't even desire to be such people. Don't aspire to be such people. Be like the Son of Man, who came to be not to be served, but to serve. And so it's a remarkable text for its brevity, but when he says you know, right? This is one of those dangerous rhetorical statements unless it's true. Which of the prophets did your fathers not kill was a dangerous question, wasn't it? Because they could have said, well, there was... No, They killed him. Well, no, they killed him. No, they killed him, right? So you can see the power of that kind of rhetoric. So he says, the rulers of the Gentiles do this. Like the earlier men. Whose sons do they take tax from? Their own or somebody else's? Everyone knows the answer, right? So whether they were informed by 1 Samuel 8 or just informed by common human affairs, by the time of Jesus, the rhetoric he used says, everyone knows they are self-aggrandizing knuckleheads, right? Everyone knows that. And we just have to find some way of dealing with them and getting them out of our hair. If it means taking a coin out of a fish's mouth, if that's what it takes, do it, right? Do whatever it takes to get these knuckleheads off our back so that we can go on and try to live life. But let's do the very best we can to deflect their negative influence on us, because they are, after all, self-aggrandizing. All they care about is being served. They do not care about serving. And so the very nature of what they do is discordant with what we are doing. That's what led to the Anabaptist tradition. There's that enormous element of truth in the Anabaptist tradition. Now, I don't embrace it. Yule doesn't embrace it. But we understand why they embraced it. They actually say it's unlawful for a Christian to participate in government in any way. Yule and I don't say it's unlawful. We just say, why in the world would anyone want to do it? Right? This is like something that comes out of a fish's mouth. Right? Well, how do you want to mess with stuff like that? The whole thing's just unsavory, it would be the point. Not that you couldn't do it. So the final point of Jesus is one that you might not have thought fits in here, but I'm persuaded that it is. In the three temptations in Matthew's gospel, one of them, the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, which could be translated riches in that context. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, him only shall you serve. Note when Satan offers to Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and all of their wealth, glory, or riches, however you translate that portion, that Jesus doesn't say, they're not yours to give. He does not say, they're not yours to give. God is sovereign, they belong to God. He doesn't say that. His answer implies that the devil does have all the kingdoms of the world, and they are his to give. And note that Jesus just doesn't care for all the kingdoms in the world and their glory. He cares about disrupting Satan's rule over the human race. And he will use his power to rescue humans eternally. And no amount of earthly, current, temporal sovereignty interests him in the least, or any of its benefits, its wealth or glory or riches. Doesn't interest him at all. He wants a different thing altogether. And so interestingly, the devil doesn't want them. He's got them and offers them up. And Jesus doesn't want them. The one thing they agree on, Jesus and the devil here, is there something more important than the earthly kingdoms and their riches. Because Satan wants the souls of men forever, and Jesus wants the souls of men forever. And each would negotiate away present earthly power to get it. Isn't that interesting? If the devil threw all that at Jesus, what would he have left for Gordon and for Smith? Right? He would have spent everything that he had right there. But he was willing to get it if he could have his reign over the human souls forever, over Adam's race. He would negotiate away all human government to get the souls of Adam's race. And Jesus, for all of those kingdoms and their riches, would not have them rather than the souls of Adam's race. And so they do agree on that the one thing is more valuable than the other. And that's what they both are intent upon. And so Satan's lost everything. Now, if that view sounds negative, don't forget later that Jesus' apostle John says, beloved, we are God's children, but the entire world is in the power of the evil one. So students sometimes have suggested that they thought my view of civil authority in the present age was a little negative. And I said, I'm optimistic compared to the apostle John. The entire world is in the hands of the evil one, he says. And so by that, I'm rosy, I'm Pollyanna. Everything's lovely, right? It's the best of all possible worlds. I'm fairly positive by comparison to John's candid statement, or I think what's implicit in Jesus's here. So what I think happens is, from what Jesus says, it is much easier to go back to 1 Samuel 8 and say of the two options, that God will miraculously give Israel a bad king because of her wickedness, or he will ordinarily give her a bad king. That is to say, that kings are ordinarily bad. There's no miracle necessitated in that situation. If you get a king, that's what kings do. They take, they take, they take. They don't tax their own sons, they tax other people's sons. Right? So I think everything in the Gospels teaches us to think that in 1 Samuel 8, the way to read it is, you've asked for a crazy thing. This is the worst of all possible things you could ask for. The costs and the benefits do not come out too heavily on the benefits side. They come out heavily on the costs side. And this is a crazy thing for you to ask for. And so Yahweh doesn't have to miraculously intervene to give them a bad king. They just get bad kings, including David, the ostensible man after God's own heart. And if David is a man after God's own heart, I'm Shaquille O'Neal. He is not a man after God's own heart. He is a wicked, murdering, self-aggrandizing, adulterous, friend-betraying rascal. And the term only appears before he served as Israel's king, not afterwards. It is not a term of divine approval when David retires and they have a retirement dinner and give him a watch. And God says, here's a man after my own heart. It's what he says in contemptuous judgment through the prophet to Saul as for why Saul was removed and why David's older brothers were not elected, because I'll choose my own king to rule, and it won't be you, Saul. But David had not done one thing, hadn't slain Goliath, had not lifted a finger to govern Israel at the time this designation was used of him. But the frequency with which we hear it in Christian circles, you'd think it's repeated 100 times in Holy Scripture, and especially as a term of approval at the end of David's ministry, when it is in fact said before he does a single thing. And so it is not and cannot be a term of approval. It's simply God's sovereignty, saying in judgment to Saul, you aren't what I want. If they have to have a king, it's got to be better than you. I'll try someone else, and I'll try this one. And then when that one wants to build a house for him, he says, forget it. I'll make a house for you instead. Put a descendant on your throne forever. Keep your house. Right? So there's no indication that there was a general divine approval over David, who was a rascal of a rascal, nor of Saul, nor of Solomon. In fact, they were all rascals of rascals, because 1 Samuel 8 said they will all be rascals of rascals. Right? It told us that that would be the case. And so we had that wonderful little passage in 1 Samuel 8 saying, here's what we should expect from Israel's kings. Take 8 times. And then we look at the history of the kings, you and I, and we read them thinking, oh boy, that's just when God was God and men were men and kings ruled over Israel. And you and I, remember when you read the narrative books of the Old Testament, you keep looking for a good one. And there's maybe two. Josiah, his reforms are pretty good. Hezekiah, you have a couple in there that didn't allow the people to worship the Baals. You had one or two who resisted the ordinary tendency, but all the rest did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. It becomes a terminus technicus after David. It's first used when Nathan brings judgment to David. Why have you done this which is evil in God's eyes? You have killed Uriah the Hittite. And then in the rest of the history of the chroniclers and the kings, when they evaluate, and he did what was evil in God's sight. It becomes the normal way that they simply describe all but Josiah, Hezekiah, just a couple little blips on the screen to the contrary. And you and I are frustrated when we read the Old Testament. We want our kings to be good. Why aren't they good? But the Bible told us in 1 Samuel 8 they wouldn't be good, that they'd be dreadful. And for some reason, and that's why I say 1 Samuel 8 is the most significant unread or unrecognized text, because if we read it and recognized it, we wouldn't be so surprised and find ourselves saying, why was this king wicked? What a surprise. Instead we say, another wicked king. Chalk it up. Just what you expect. Right? You're just like an umpire counting strikes and balls. Yep, it's got to be a strike or a ball. Right? Either a strike or it's a ball. Strike or it's a ball. Nothing new here. Right? They're like the state police on the side of the road when there's been a small fender bender. Everyone's slowing down to 5 miles an hour on the interstates. Ooh, a fender bender. Nothing to see here, keep it moving. Nothing to see here, keep it moving. Right? 1 Samuel 8 says that's the way we should look at the monarchy when it arrives. One self-aggrandizing person after another. So that by the time of Jesus he can say, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Right? Or he can say rhetorically to Peter, whose sons do they tax? Their own or somebody else's? And he knows the answer. And so what we have is this reality that in its fallen form, when you give fallen creatures power, they corrupt themselves by it. And so Lord Acton was right. His dictum is actually exactly right. By the way, it's a fascinating letter in his context with Bishop Creighton, because both, were historians of the Reformation. And Creighton wrote a fairly positive reference to the popes at the time, and Lord Acton would say, no, there were previous popes and church deliverances that had also objected to indulgences and to their sale, and said the only thing that occurred in the original Reformation of the 95 Theses, and he says this, one particular point, Acton says, one particular point, and it alone led to the disruption, and that was the sale of indulgences. And the Pope could have referred to earlier papal announcements and concurred with Luther, and the entire disruption would have been avoided. Right? So it's a very, very serious letter, very significant letter. And in that context, Creighton tries to defend his defense of the popes of the time, the Borgia papistry. And then Lord Acton's response is, I disagree with your principle of evaluating popes and kings. You think we must overlook their faults. And he says, but that we cannot do and read history correctly, because power tends to corrupt. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. Almost all great men were bad men. That's what Acton said. And so it was a very, very serious sloganesque kind of a thing that Acton said. Acton had learned to read human history and human governance in such a way that the more power you give a person, even if the person was not corrupt before, he becomes corrupted by his power. So he didn't merely say that corrupt people seek power, but then previously not corrupt people are corrupted by its exercise. And therefore, as an historian, if we sort of overlook the failures of the powerful on the ground, that we need people to look up to and to admire, he said, then we are overlooking moral appraisal of the people who most need it, because they are the most likely to be corrupt. Right? What a remarkable thing. One would be tempted to say Lord Acton had read the Bible. And of course he had read the Bible, right? But he has the same despairing view of government that I think you see in 1 Samuel 8. He has the fear and dread of it that Genesis 9 might have encouraged us to have. And he has the same contemptuous disregard for it in some sense that Jesus had. So if you have a chance, by the way, read the letter of Lord Acton back to Creighton at some point. It's only 7 or 8 pages long, and it is a very, very fascinating and interesting read. But the slogan that we remember is at the pith of it in some ways, especially the following sentence. He not only says power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, but almost all great men were bad men. Almost all great men were bad men, because power corrupts. So almost anyone we recognize as having been, quote, influential and powerful and great is bad. And if he weren't bad before he had power, he was bad once he had it. And so think of this in the last 25 or 30 years. It hasn't happened recently. But back in the 80s, I think, there were the occasional congressmen who thought that the problem was career politicians in Washington. And they ran on the theory that we should go to term limits, that everyone serves a 6-year term, not 2 for the House and 4 for the Senate with re-elections, but a 6-year term, and then you're done, and that's it. And of course, what happens when those people are elected? They cancel their plans to diselect themselves. Right? Almost none of them ever followed through, because once they became career politicians, they wanted to remain career politicians. So even people who ran on the theory that the problem with career politicians is they're corrupted by it, let's get in office and change the thing, they get in office and they get corrupted by it too. Right? And so if you're going to work in a leper society and you come home one day and say, honey, I don't know, I was looking in the mirror this morning and my skin looked funny. Well, you've been working in a leper colony for 16 years. What did you expect? Right? You're going to become leprous. It's part of the territory. And so the same thing with power. It's a corrupting thing. Humans don't know what to do with it, and it's a very unusual person who can use it without being corrupted by it. And I think Acton's view is perfectly biblical in that sense. He looks at the matter the way the others do. So on that encouraging note, let me open the floor to questions about Jesus' understanding of those who exercise civil authority, informed a little by 1 Samuel 8.
Just a question about the whole power thing. So, is it best not to seek power? if you want to remain faithful, how does a person go into a powerful position, even as a Christian, when they know the effects it's going to have on them?
I think the answer I normally gave, and I don't know if I did it when you were doing the Humatoan class or not, but because it comes up in many of those classes, we talk about government. But my normal answers, I use the analogy of a physician in a third world or developing nation. The hospitals are not as clean as ours. The conditions are not as sterile. Backup medical care for you and your staff will be episodic. And if you want to be involved in medical missions, you need to count the cost of discipleship, and you need to consider the possibility that you and or your staff will have your health compromised as the result of this commitment. And if you're willing to go into it knowing that, and to a lesser degree, this might be if you work for the CDC in Atlanta, because every now and then they get something they don't know what it is. If you're willing to do that kind of thing because of your desire to improve the lot of the human race, it's of course lawful to do so, but you dare not do so without a due estimate of its cost. Or if you decide you're going to be career military, suppose you're a young man at Grove City College, you're thinking of signing up with the Marines, they've got their recruiters on campus, and someone comes and says, should I serve with the Marines? And say, well, you got to realize that you may take a round through the head at some point, right? If you like 30 caliber rounds coming at you and the collision costs are shooting 30 caliber rounds, well, there might be a very nice profession. But don't go in there thinking you're necessarily going to have a desk job. That's what the recruiters will promise you. And they will tell you, of course, that 85% of our military personnel serve in non-combat positions. But you could be the other 15% once you sign that paper. Don't kid yourself. You may end up one of the other 15%. Now, if your love for your country and the defense of the innocent is such that you're willing to run that risk, of course you may do so. But you run that risk. And if you're going to serve in public positions, in terms of civil government, you have to run the risk of moral compromise and be very alert. Just like the physician washes his hands frequently, not to be dirtied, the person who works in government has to continually metaphorically wash his hands because it is an inherently corrupting thing. So it's lawful as long as you do it wisely and with a due recognition of its inherently corrupting tendencies. I'm surprised Mother Teresa lived as long as she did. All she did was offer hospice care to people who were dying in Calcutta. She had no authority to issue medicine, So she was not authorized to practice medicine in India. She simply gave hospice care. As people died, she put a washcloth on their forehead, maybe gave them a little something to drink, comforted them. But who knows what diseases they were carrying, communicable diseases. And she served for, 40, 45, almost 50 years, and didn't die from it. Pretty remarkable. But whenever she decided to go to Calcutta and do what she did, probably that little woman knew what she was getting involved in, and that it would be a very dangerous thing. And out of her love for humanity, she did this dangerous thing, but with a due awareness that she had a very grave likelihood of having a brief life, because she probably should have contracted many diseases that she didn't contract. So I think that analogy still may work.
Application of the principles that we're seeing so far in your presentation, or am I missing something?
It is a sound, though it's an even sounder implication of the biblical teaching on the nature of church power. So really, I think the point would be in the nature of church power, that the church is not given any authority to change or work with governments and so forth. Its power is spiritual, not material, you might say, that sort of a thing. But yes, I think it would also be an inference from what I'm saying that normally what you have when you have regime changes in governments, you just replace self-aggrandizing person A with self-aggrandizing person B. On my website, I have a little thing now called electoral process, because 8 years ago I absented myself from the electoral process for 10 to 12 years. I wasn't sure if I should do a decade 10 or 12, which would take me through 3 election cycles. So I said 10 to 12, and I listed the 11 reasons there one paragraph each on my website. You can I haven't participated in the electoral process for the last 8 years or so, and part of what I say is that I also don't watch much sports anymore unless it's a social occasion, like the Super Bowl or some friends want to get together or something maybe. But I say that politics and sports are the same way. If you've observed either one for a while, the only thing that changes is the names on the back of the jersey. Right? There's nothing that changes. If you've seen one sporting event, you've seen them all. Unusually well-prepared athletes, performing at a very high level, and ordinarily an exceptional performance or two turned in by one or two. And at the same time, ordinarily an occasional blunder. The referees and umpires actually do a remarkable job. You look at the replays of calling things correctly and occasionally make a mistake and so forth. And so if as I said, growing up watching sports all the time, I realized that, the only thing that really changes is the names on the jersey. Nothing else changes. You've seen it all before. And it's the same thing with sports. One knucklehead makes unreasonable claims to improve the world by being elected to office, gets in office, and the world is not demonstrably any better for his having been there. And so after a while, you just lose interest in both of them and say, well, been there, done that. So now I don't know what I'll do at the end of my 10/12-year period, whether I'll re-enter the electoral fray or not, or just enjoy staying out of it. But I don't think it's likely to ever do much good. Yeah, the church, qua church, won't do it. Though it will permit individuals who are members of the church, if they're willing to assume the risk, to involve themselves as individuals therein if they have a sense of calling to do that. So not everyone's willing to do something as dangerous as what Mother Teresa did, but we admire her for the calling she had to do that. And so we would acknowledge that certain individuals will involve themselves in the political processes. By the way, I'm still involved in the political process, just not the electoral process. I think that of the 7 or 8 ways of influencing the political process, probably the least effective is participating in elections. But there are other ways of being more or less effective that I am willing to sully myself with, as it were, just not participating in voting. And I list those reasons there. So, yeah, I think that what happens is we try to say there's a lot of good that can be done in a fallen world that does not require a government to do it. That the age of totalitarianism is still only 150 years old. Kuyper probably the first to sort of observe it. But probably to the late 19th century, we didn't have communication and travel developed to the point that the sort of modern totalitarian state could exist. It's all fairly recent. Prior to that, human solutions were almost never dependent upon government action. Almost every hospital in the United States was privately owned until after World War II. Almost every academic institution prior to the First World War was private. You have Presbyterian institutions, Lutheran institutions, and so forth. Harvard was designed to prepare people to be gospel ministers, and so forth. So it really wasn't until the 20th century that we assumed that human problems could only be solved by governments. That was not a conceit that other previous generations embraced. It's a fairly new one. And so I think individuals can still find many ways of assisting their fellow human beings without necessarily doing so in their gubernatorial process or the electoral process within that. But isn't it surprising, we haven't gotten to Romans 13 yet, we'll do that later this morning, but isn't it surprising that Genesis 9 regards the whole institution of human government as somewhat fearful, so that even the animals fear and dread, and by man shall his blood be shed, is a frightening sort of a thought, isn't it? How can we do that responsibly? And then Samuel just promising, this is what your king's going to do. They're going to be takers. They're going to take and take and take and take and take. And David, after God's own heart, takes Uriah and makes him run before the chariots. And he takes Bathsheba, someone's daughter and someone's husband. So it's a horrible snake of a person. They're all this way. And then Jesus just throws out these statements. Well, this is just the way they are. And so it's a much bleaker, I think, picture than the picture that we normally had as citizens of the United States, where we were sort of reared to think that, at least in our case, we emerged like Mr. Clean, that American government's different than all other human government, that somehow with the advent of Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton, Mr. Clean took on political power for the first time in human history, and it has remained so until LBJ or since, or whenever, pick your spot. But I think we'd find human governments pretty much like the Bible says.
And it's a perfect segue for my question, I think, into Creighton's exchange.
Yes, Creighton's words would not have surprised any of them. I mean, they were a century later, but they wouldn't have surprised any of them. So I think that from Renaissance on, you can see political theory increasingly recognizing candidly the tendency of power to corrupt. And the reason it took that probably is the printing press, when all that we knew about the world was word of mouth, oral cultures. Probably there could be very few real assessments of current or previous governors. And so the failures of public figures were less easy to publicize. After that, their awareness, if not of general human depravity, the special depravity of rulers, certainly prevailed. And they had theories of government beginning in Great Britain and then moving to the colonies even more so, that tried to separate powers and to balance powers and try to provide checks and balances, as we call them, to prevent human depravity in the quest for power from becoming a destructive thing. But they're a little bit like people who leave an endowment to an institution. There's no guarantee that the people who have that, once they've buried you, will do with it what you wanted them to do with it. And so you could look at American history from the founding to the present as a continual challenge between the three branches for sovereignty. Because you have the imperial presidency at times, you have an imperial Congress at times, you have an imperial Supreme Court at times. It's very, very difficult to find a way to prevent each of those branches from stepping outside of its limited sphere vis-a-vis the other two. Because the other two do not, in fact, easily balance one another. So you could see that that was their intention, and that's their legacy. Their endowment, as it were, was a fairly carefully balanced form of government in which the elected branch was the more powerful, and the other two less so. But you could argue that at least since Roosevelt, that tension has been unsettled. That maybe the elastic is still stretched, maybe the bands are broken, maybe it's stretched too far, but they left us a legacy that was informed by the mistakes in Europe. And so they had this unique point of view historically, that they knew of Europe's failures. But if you start a new government, you don't have vested interests to resist your reformation. You have no government. So there were wise thinkers in political theory from the 17th century on in Europe who saw the problems with their existing forms of government. But how do you appeal to the current MPs, members of Parliament, to revise Parliament when they are parts thereof? Whereas when they leave there and come across the ocean to another place and are under Parliament's authority, but then consider the possibility of declaring their independence of Parliament and establishing their own government, they really do not have vested interests to remove. If they can just get rid of the people on the other side of the Atlantic, they can start de novo from scratch in some sense. So I think that's what they were hoping they could do. Could start with something that was better in some respects than the previous ones. But then they expressed their fears from the outset. Right off the bat, they expressed their fears. If you've read the recent biography of John Quincy Adams, by the way, it's a nice follow-up to McCullough's wonderful biography of John Adams. In 1836, I think it was, John Quincy Adams said, my hopes for the endurance of the Union are now, he didn't say exterminated, but gone. I forget what term he used, but they had now expired. So by 1836, he didn't think the Union could last any longer. And that's because Massachusetts and Connecticut had deliberated secession in 1804, 1810, and 1814. And he and his father had fought hard to evade northern secession. But he didn't think that the three particular populations that constituted the republic could remain united. So by 1836, he had lost hope for the Union. By the way, it's interesting to know that secession was not a South Carolinian invention. It was considered in the Massachusetts and Connecticut legislatures half a century before the so-called hotheads in South Carolina brought the matter up. But in John Quincy Adams especially, he thought the mercantile trading classes in the Northeast, the agricultural classes in the South, and the westward expanding classes were really three different nations, and that the form of government designed for the one would not and could not necessarily serve the interests of the other two. And so he just thought it was untenable that one government could serve equally, and especially with import and export taxes. Inevitably, that favors the mercantile class versus the agricultural class. Every decision that's made on import-export taxing affects them differently, favors the one and injures the other, or vice versa. It's just not possible to reconcile those interests. And then the westward expanding interests, they had their own concerns and what their necessities were, what they expected from a government, what their needs were from a government, which were very different than the other two. So it's lasted longer than they thought, and both Jefferson and John Adams expressed their surprise as they got older that the Union had existed as long as it did. Now, I'm not suggesting that the founders expected it to be temporary. I'm just saying that within 20 years or so of it, they recognized how fragile it was. And then a little bit further along, despaired of the possibility of its endurance. By the way, many of us think it doesn't endure. Many people, whatever their views, pro and con, believe that the combination of the 13th and 14th Amendments altered the nature of the previous republic, and that what emerges after that isn't. Remember Doughty, wasn't his name Doughty, whose book on the Civil War in the 1970s was called The Death of a Nation? I mean, it was seriously proposed by an historian. I think he taught at Brown or something like that. And Doughty argued that the conclusion at Appomattox was the death of a nation, not the union of a nation. That what emerged from that was not the nation that had been here before. So whether he's pro that or con it, whether you like it or dislike it, some fairly thoughtful people have said what we have now is not the original republic anyway. It's a different kind of a thing. It's evolved into something else than what it originally was. It's fun to watch it as an observer.
We'll wind up in 1 Samuel 8, even if they didn't think that way exactly.
Yeah, it really is interesting that the anti-federalist impulse was so strong. And some of the Federalists who argued for ratification within 3 to 4 and 5 years, such as Jefferson, started wondering if they hadn't made a mistake. And he was the most rosy-colored of them all because, remember, to his death, he still defended the French Revolution and the guillotine. A little revolution is good every now and then, he would say. And Adams thought he was a knucklehead, and justly so, probably in this particular case. They were a little too. I think that's where the Enlightenment thing disserved them. I think they still had too much of the Enlightenment confidence that human reason would work. If you think of the fundamental theory of Adam Smith, that we can expect people to act in terms of their enlightened self-interest. I don't know where he got that from, but in the history of the human race, there haven't been more than 3 people who did. Right? That we do not act in terms of our enlightened self-interest. There's now a new field of academic study called behavioral economics. They call it behavioral economics because it actually looks at how people behave and not how Adam Smith theorized that they would behave. And they demonstrate through empirically demonstrable means that humans, in fact, are irrational and do not act in terms of their own enlightened self-interest. And so any economic model that predicates the one, they say, doesn't work because the people, in fact, don't act that way. I do think you see in the Founding Fathers the unjustified notion that because they were refined, educated, Renaissance kinds of Enlightenment people, that all of the human race were like them. And they quickly found that the rest of the human race, if not they themselves, was full of rapacity and greed. And so it didn't work too long. Those are fascinating people to read, by the way, the behavioral economists. They're fascinating people.
Could you expound on the other ways to get involved?
Well, very briefly in there, I do justify by definition that what I'm talking about is the electoral process and not the other Archimedean levers. Some people think the only way you can move government is through voting. But there are referenda, there are proposed legislation, there are lobbying, right? There are letters to Congress. That is to say, some of us 8, 9 years ago thought that Pennsylvania should declare the porcupine a nuisance animal the way the groundhog is because they're so dangerous. Now, the groundhog injures agricultural stuff. Tractor axles break when they go in holes and stuff. They're a nuisance animal, and you can kill them or trap them whenever you see them. And eventually the Pennsylvania legislature demurred, and 3 years ago the porcupines became also a nuisance animal. So I've shot 4 of them out there in the woods where I camp and spend time because they destroy trees. They're a very destructive animal. Used to be I couldn't lawfully shoot them. I shot them anyway, but now I shoot them under the guise of the government. They didn't become less destructive or more destructive due to the government's act. But in that case, enough sportsmen and enough people who enjoyed the woods said, they can denude a forest in about 30 years if they are left unchecked, if there's no fish or cats or other natural predators to them. And so in a case like that, people shrugged their head and they said, well, there's no porcupine lobby. Right? And if there were, it'd be kind of prickly and hard to deal with, one could imagine. In a case like that, they just needed to be made aware of the fact that these were destructive. And they realized there was no political cost to changing the law. So you can actually propose legislation. You can do referenda where there's a public vote on an issue. You get an X number of votes, and the populace can address the matter if the legislatures don't address the matter, right? So there are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 other ways that people can lawfully work within the political process in addition to voting. But we've come to think that voting is the only and best way, and I think especially due to gerrymandering, but also to the repeal of Feingold and McCain, that it's probably the least effective way to work, and the other ways are all more. But yeah, I think you'd find those outlined in that little paper on electoral process. Are we time for a little break between now and the next session?
Nope, we've got a little more time.
Got time for a little bit more QA?
I have a question.
That's why he says it's not time for a break. Old feathering his nest Bob, right?
I'm going to drop my line in the water here and hopefully catch a fish with it. Am I doing the right thing or not? So, any insight into that?
Yeah, Modern Reformation asked me to write a little thing 6 or 7 years ago that ended up being titled something like Distractions to the Church, in which the thesis was, if I were the devil, no comments, if I were the devil, if I could not get the church simply to do evil, could I get it to expend its energies and resources in ways that were less a threat to me than other ways? And so now I use the word church both officially, ecclesiastically, and unofficially as the members thereof. So if I were the devil, I simply would not want clear administration of word and sacrament, people devoted to prayer, or people devoted to doing Christ-like acts of service in their community. All of which I think would have the tendency to ruin my kingdom if I were the devil. But if he's willing to give all of the earthly kingdoms and their power to Jesus, then my guess is he doesn't care at all if you're involved in the political process. He'd much rather you expend your energies there than in other areas. So I think I'd be somewhat more content if the change from my childhood to my soon, I hope to be forthcoming grandchildren's childhoods I think the change would be this. We just expected all Christians to be involved in the political process and to vote. Ministers used to even say sometimes in Christian pulpits, I know you'll find this semi-heretical, they used to actually say it's your Christian duty to vote. Can't believe those guys weren't removed from office, but they said those things. They should have been removed from office for such a thing. But they actually said it. And now what I would rather do is say, let's encourage people to ask Marsha's question. Is, in a fallen world, is involvement in governmental service a valid calling for some people? And the answer is yes, it is. But the overall cultural mandate to fill the earth and exercise dominion over the created order would include writing symphonies and 14-line sonnets and so forth, and teaching Boy Scouts how to tie knots and so forth, and supervising ballet classes and so forth. There's an enormous range of cultural mandate activity that humans do. And there's no particular reason, I think, to mandate the one at the expense of the others. I think I would rather them have people have their own sense of calling, energized by an imagination sanctified by the Holy Spirit, that they see someone who's a great ballet instructor and say, I think maybe I want to do that. They see someone working hard to reform the political process and say, I think I want to do that, right? Instead of thinking that we have to oblige everyone to teach Greek because I do so, to say it's okay if 3 people on the planet teach Greek. Probably don't want more than that. It's not you don't want it to get out of control. But as long as it's a modest little curiosity, it can do very little harm. But I think there ought to be a place for people to be content with their own calling without saying everyone should do it. So I think that's a change I'd like to see.
Things that are not virtues in the New Testament at all.
It's extremely difficult to avoid dispassion in certain arenas of life. Parenting is difficult. We invest so much in it that when someone parents in a different style than we do, they may say nothing, and we almost get defensive because they're not doing what we did, right? So it's very difficult to be dispassionate, I think, about child rearing, especially the rearing of our own. It's extremely difficult in the present moment to be dispassionate about public policy issues. And there may be 2 or 3 others like that appeal to the worst in us instead of the best. And so the present situation as a media ecologist, of course, because it's soundbite and quick and image-based. So at least it took a while to write the Federalist Papers and a while to read them. And so you might start reading Federalist 14 on a day when you're in a cranky mood. By the time you finish it, you've modulated over, you've had pecan pie or something, and now God's in his heaven and all's right with the world, and you've gotten over your crankiness. And so, but when you're constantly YouTube videos and BuzzFeed stuff and sound bites, and this kind, that sort of stuff is like Kindle for passion. It is not Kindle for ration or reason. Image, according to OU, is essentially passionate and non-rational because it doesn't make propositional truth claims. You can evaluate a sentence as to whether it's a well-substantiated truth claim. You can't really evaluate an image that way. They inherently appeal to us as passionate beings and not rational beings. So if the seesaw is moved in the 20th century from language to image, wherever it is on that spectrum now, and I think it's beyond 50 in terms of functional human behavior, it's probably way up like this, we've simply become a fairly passionate rather than reasonable or rational people. So the postmodernists are at least right on that. If for them modernity means enlightenment, with its commitment to rational thought and so forth, certainly postmodernism is right in saying we are not rational in the present moment. We may have been rarely before, but we aren't now. And we don't admire the people who are. At least Madison and Jefferson and Adams and people like this were in some measures admired for their erudition, if not for their partisan interest due to their portions of the country. But today we wouldn't even admire a person who had the capacity to reason well about things. It's a vestigial kind of an organ, like an appendix, that we don't really need. It's just not quite a necessary thing. So we're not Homo sapiens as much as Homo passians. Is that we're feeling humans, not cogitating humans. I'm not saying we should be Dr. Spock. I mean, Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Merely rational, but there ought to be some place for it, for loving the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Luke adds dianoia to it, because the Hebrew lave could mean either passion or reason. And so Luke says, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, throwing dianoia in there to make clear that the Hebrew implied that, and the Greek might not. So there ought to be some way to love God with the mind. Now that you've asked your question, Bob, is it time for a break? Now that Bob has asked his question, he informed us that it's time for a break. Let's give Bob a break.